The morning sun had barely risen over the city skyline, painting the hospital's glass windows in shades of gold. Doctors, nurses, and patients streamed through the revolving doors, the steady pulse of life inside the building beginning another day. It was a place of urgency and compassion, a place where every second mattered, and where countless lives depended on the people who worked inside. Dr. Jonathan Miller walked briskly up the hospital steps, a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. His white coat was folded neatly inside, though he hadn't put it on yet. He had just come off a grueling 36-hour shift the night before, caught only a few hours of sleep, and returned to handle another emergency. His eyes were tired but determined, the kind of eyes that had seen both miracles and heartbreak within these walls. As he approached the entrance, a uniformed security guard stepped forward, blocking his path with an outstretched arm. "Hold it right there," the guard said, his voice firm but dismissive. Jonathan blinked, momentarily confused. "Excuse me?" The guard looked him up and down. Without his white coat, Jonathan was just another middle-aged man in rumpled clothes, his stubble darkening his jawline. His sneakers were worn from countless shifts spent on his feet, his bag scuffed from years of use. He didn't look like the polished executives who often strode through these doors, nor like the patients who carried paperwork and ID badges. "This entrance is for staff and authorized personnel only," the guard said flatly. "Patients and visitors use the side entrance." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "I am staff. I've worked here for 15 years. I'm a surgeon." The guard's eyes narrowed, unconvinced. "You don't look like a doctor." The words stung more than Jonathan expected. He opened his bag, pulled out his white coat, and held it up. His name, Dr. Jonathan Miller, MD, Chief of Surgery, was embroidered neatly on the chest pocket. "This is mine. I belong here." But the guard crossed his arms, smirking slightly. "Anybody can buy a coat and stitch a name on it. You'll need to step aside until I verify," with administration people passing through the doors slowed, glancing curiously at the exchange. A nurse Jonathan recognized hurried by, giving him a sympathetic look but not stopping. A couple in business attire whispered to each other as they walked past, casting judgmental eyes. Jonathan felt his stomach twist. He was standing in front of the very hospital where he had performed life-saving surgeries, the building where his sweat and sleepless nights had saved countless lives. And yet, here he was, treated like an intruder. "I don't have time for this," Jonathan said, his voice tightening. "There's a patient waiting for me. I have a surgery scheduled in 40 minutes. The guard shrugged. "Not my problem. Rules are rules." Jonathan clenched his jaw. He thought of the patient, an elderly man prepped for surgery, his family waiting anxiously. He thought of the team already assembled in the operating room, counting on him. He thought of the vow he had taken all those years ago. Do no harm. Save lives whenever possible. And now, because of arrogance and prejudice, he was being stopped at the door. Other guards had gathered, their radios crackling. Jonathan's presence had somehow escalated into a spectacle. He tried again, his tone calmer, though his frustration boiled beneath the surface. "Please, call Dr. Patel, the chief anesthesiologist, or Dr. Sanders from cardiology. They'll confirm who I am." But the guard just shook his head. "Until I get confirmation from admin, you're not going in." Humiliation washed over him. His hands, the same hands that had steadied scalpels and stitched arteries, now hung useless at his sides. Around him, whispers grew louder. To these onlookers, he was not a healer, not a doctor. They saw only what the guard suggested, someone who didn't belong. And then came the final insult. Another guard muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jonathan to hear, probably some washed-up guy pretending to be important. Jonathan's chest tightened. Anger burned hot in his veins, but so did something deeper. Resolve. He had faced worse in operating rooms, where seconds determined life or death. He could face this too. He took a step back, lifted his chin, and looked the guard directly in the eye. "You may not believe me now, but one day you will remember this moment. One day you'll know exactly who I am." The guard smirked, unimpressed. But Jonathan turned away, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor as he walked toward the administrative office. Each step carried the weight of humiliation, but also the spark of something else. Determination. Because if this was how a hospital treated its own doctors, something had to change. And Jonathan Miller was not the kind of man to back down. Long before the humiliating moment at the hospital entrance, Jonathan Miller's life had been defined by service. From the time he was a boy, he had wanted to heal. While other children dreamed of baseball stardom or racing cars, Jonathan had sat in the corner of his mother's small kitchen with a second-hand anatomy book, tracing diagrams of the human body with wide-eyed wonder. He grew up in a modest neighborhood, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. Money was always tight, but his parents instilled in him values that mattered far more: integrity, compassion, and the belief that hard work could open doors. Jonathan worked nights in diners, saved every dollar, and clawed his way through medical school. There were times he considered giving up, when exhaustion blurred the pages of his textbooks, when he stared at tuition bills larger than his family's yearly income. But every time he remembered the promise he had made to himself as a boy: "I will help people live." His residency was brutal. Weeks blurred into months of endless hours, running from one emergency to another, sleeping on couches in break rooms when he could. He held the hands of patients in their final moments, scrubbed in for surgeries that tested every ounce of his endurance, and learned to work through the fog of fatigue. Many of his peers quit or switched specialties. Jonathan pressed on. Not because he was fearless, he often shook before his first solo procedures, but because he refused to walk away from those who needed him. Over the years, his reputation grew. He wasn't the kind of doctor who boasted at conferences or published flashy research papers. Instead, his reputation lived in the quiet gratitude of families who whispered thank you through tears in ICU waiting rooms. He was the doctor who came back after a double shift to check on a child recovering from heart surgery. The surgeon who skipped lunch to explain test results carefully to a nervous patient. The man who remembered birthdays of his long-term patients, who brought coffee to tired nurses, who believed that medicine was as much about kindness as it was about science. Jonathan was not perfect. He had his flaws. He sometimes lost his temper when bureaucracy slowed patient care, sometimes pushed himself too hard, sacrificing his own health. His marriage had not survived the long nights and constant exhaustion. But even in the wreckage of his personal life, he found strength in the work. The hospital became both his battlefield and his sanctuary. There was one night that defined him more than any other. A highway accident had sent a flood of victims into the ER. Cars twisted, lives shattered. Jonathan was called in from home. He ran through those doors without hesitation, still in jeans and a sweatshirt, pulling on his gloves as he arrived. For 18 straight hours, he worked, moving from one patient to the next, performing surgeries, barking orders, refusing to stop. When the dust settled, many were saved who otherwise would not have been. Later, a nurse told him quietly, "We call you the man who runs toward the fire." He never asked for recognition. He never sought awards. But the hospital walls bore his unseen fingerprints, on the patients who walked out alive, on the colleagues who leaned on him in crises, on the generations of interns who whispered his name with respect. And yet, despite all this, Jonathan remained humble. He never forgot the boy who had studied anatomy books at a kitchen table. When medical students shadowed him, he told them, "The scalpel doesn't make you a doctor. Your heart does." His sacrifices were many. He missed family gatherings, lost touch with friends, spent holidays in operating rooms while others celebrated at home. But he never resented it. Saving lives was not a burden. It was his calling. So when the guard at the hospital door told him he didn't belong, it was more than an insult. It was an erasure of years of sacrifice, of decades of service, of the very identity he had built. It was as if everything he had poured into his profession had vanished with a single dismissive glance. Jonathan Miller was more than a man in rumpled clothes with a tired face. He was a surgeon who had given his life to others, a healer whose worth could never be measured by a uniform or an ID badge. And though the humiliation stung deeply, he carried with him something far greater, the knowledge that he had lived a life of service. That truth could not be stripped away by arrogance, nor denied by ignorance. What the guard and the watching crowd did not know was this: Jonathan had spent his entire life preparing for moments like these, not to be humiliated, but to rise from it. Just as he had once steadied his hands under the bright lights of an operating room, he would steady himself now, because his story was far from over. Hospitals are places of healing, but for the doctors who work inside them, they can also be prisons of exhaustion. Jonathan Miller knew this truth intimately. His days began before sunrise and ended long after the city lights had flickered on. He moved from patient to patient like a soldier marching through a battlefield, steady, focused, but always under fire. It wasn't bullets he dodged, but paperwork, bureaucracy, and the crushing weight of too many lives needing help all at once. He often worked shifts so long that he lost track of what day it was. He'd scrub in for a surgery in the morning, emerge 12 hours later, and realize he hadn't eaten, hadn't sat down, hadn't spoken to anyone outside the sterile walls of the operating room. Nurses sometimes pressed granola bars into his hands, insisting he take at least a bite before moving to the next case. Jonathan's apartment bore the marks of his lifestyle. Unopened mail stacked on the counter, laundry forgotten in baskets, a refrigerator half empty except for bottled water and leftover takeout. Home wasn't really a home. It was a place to collapse for a few hours before the hospital called him back. The weight of the job wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Every loss carved into him. Every patient he couldn't save lingered in his memory. He remembered their names, their faces, the sound of families crying in hallways. Those sounds followed him into his dreams, waking him in the middle of the night with a pounding heart and sweaty palms. And yet, despite the relentless grind, what hurt most was not the exhaustion, not the hunger, not even the grief. It was the way society often looked at doctors like him, with suspicion, impatience, even contempt. Patients sometimes snapped at him for delays, unaware that he had just come from performing emergency surgery. Administrators scolded him for not filling out forms quickly enough, as though paperwork mattered more than a patient's heartbeat. Insurance companies second-guessed his decisions, questioning his judgment with spreadsheets and fine print. Even within the hospital, hierarchy and politics sometimes overshadowed compassion. Executives with polished shoes and pressed suits spoke of efficiency and cost control, while Jonathan and his colleagues worked themselves raw. He remembered one meeting where an administrator suggested cutting staff in order to save money. Jonathan had nearly walked out. "You can't balance a budget on the backs of sick people," he had said sharply. But his words had been met with polite nods and ignored once the spreadsheets reappeared. There were humiliations small and large. Patients occasionally mistook him for an orderly because of his tired appearance. Visitors questioned his authority when he entered a room without his white coat. Once, in the middle of explaining a procedure to a family, a relative had asked to speak to the real doctor. Jonathan had paused, steadied himself, and repeated, "I am the real doctor." The pay, contrary to public perception, did not match the sacrifices. Yes, surgeons earned more than many, but Jonathan's debts from medical school still haunted him. The long hours, the constant stress, the missed holidays. No paycheck could buy back the years he lost or the health he sacrificed. His blood pressure had climbed. His joints ached from standing for hours. His vision sometimes blurred after sleepless nights. Colleagues around him coped in different ways. Some drank too much. Others burned out and left the profession entirely. Jonathan stayed, driven not by duty alone, but by something deeper, a belief that his work mattered, even when the world didn't notice. There was one evening that captured the essence of his struggles. He had just finished a 14-hour surgery, saving a young woman who had been brought in after a terrible accident. Exhausted, he stepped outside the hospital for air. His hands trembled from fatigue, his scrubs stained with sweat. And as he stood there, a passerby glanced at him and muttered, "Doctors make too much money for what they do." Jonathan closed his eyes, biting back a retort. The irony was bitter. People saw the paycheck, but not the price. They saw the title, but not the toll. And yet, he endured. Because for every insult, there was also gratitude. For every skeptic, there was a family that hugged him, tears streaming, because he had given them back a son, a daughter, a parent. Those moments were rare, but they kept him alive. Still, the daily struggles accumulated. They pressed on him like the weight of stones. And when the guard at the hospital door had dismissed him with a smirk, it wasn't just one insult. It was the echo of every time he had been overlooked, every sacrifice ignored, every night of sweat and pain unrecognized. Jonathan's life was proof that being a doctor was not about prestige. It was about endurance. And though the world often failed to see the cost, Jonathan carried it quietly, day after day. He didn't know it yet, but those struggles, the exhaustion, the insults, the indignities, were shaping him for something greater. They were hardening his resolve, preparing him for the moment when the world would finally have to listen. Jonathan thought the confrontation at the hospital entrance was bad enough, but what followed only deepened the wound. After being stopped at the door, he was escorted, not invited, through the lobby by the guard, as though he was some trespasser caught sneaking in. His bag, which had carried his surgical tools for years, was searched on a marble counter in front of everyone. The whispers stung worse than the search itself. "Is he lost?" one woman muttered. "Doesn't look like a doctor to me," another whispered to her husband. Jonathan clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay calm. Years in the operating room had taught him to master his emotions. You couldn't tremble with a scalpel in your hand. You couldn't panic when a patient's heartbeat flatlined. But this humiliation, this cut deeper than any surgical wound. The guard finally called the administration office, his voice loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "Yeah, I've got a man here claiming to be a doctor. Name's Miller. Says he's staff." The word claiming hung in the air like a dagger. It took several minutes before a young resident, hurrying past, stopped and gasped. "Dr. Miller? Sir, what are you doing out here?" The relief was brief. The resident's astonishment only added to the crowd's confusion. "Wait, he's a doctor?" one man scoffed. "You've got to be kidding." By the time Jonathan was finally waved through, patients and visitors alike were staring at him as though he were an imposter who had somehow slipped through the cracks. His authority, earned over decades, had been shredded in minutes. He walked quickly to the staff lounge, but whispers followed him down the hall. Two orderlies chuckled as he passed. One muttered just loud enough, "Guess even surgeons need a hall pass these days." Jonathan forced himself onward, but his chest burned. When he pushed open the lounge door, hoping for a moment of reprieve, he was met with more snickers. A group of younger doctors sat with their coffees, scrolling through their phones. One of them looked up, smirked, and said, "Hey, I heard security almost threw you out this morning." "Forget your badge, Miller." The others laughed. Jonathan froze. He had trained some of these men. He had stood beside them in operating rooms, guided their hands, corrected their mistakes. Now they treated his humiliation as entertainment. "I didn't forget anything," Jonathan said, his voice low but steady. "I was stopped because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged." The laughter died down, but the smirks remained. One doctor shrugged. "Well, maybe try dressing the part." Hard to blame them, really. Jonathan stared at him, stunned. These were supposed to be colleagues, fellow healers who understood the weight of the work, the sacrifices made. Yet they echoed the same shallow judgment as strangers in the lobby. Before he could respond, a knock at the lounge door drew their attention. A nurse peeked in, her expression uneasy. "Dr. Miller, your patient's family is asking why you were late." Their worried Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. The humiliation had delayed him, and now The very people who trusted him most, his patients, were paying the price. He nodded silently, grabbed his bag, and left the room. The surgery went smoothly. His hands never faltered, his mind never wavered. Inside the operating room, he was who he had always been. Precise, calm, unshakable. But when it was over and he peeled off his gloves, he felt a weight pressing on him that no scalpel could cut away. Later that evening, he walked past the lobby again. The same guard stood at his post, arms crossed, smirk tugging at his lips. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, but Jonathan understood the message. You may wear the coat, but to me, you'll never belong. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his dim apartment, the city lights flickering through the blinds. He replayed the day in his mind, the disbelief in the guard's voice, the whispers in the lobby, the mocking laughter of his colleagues. For the first time in years, he felt invisible, not as a man, but as a doctor, as if decades of sacrifice could be erased by one humiliating morning. He placed his worn notebook on the table, the same notebook where he kept patient notes, ideas for improvements, and the occasional late-night reflection. He wrote one sentence, his hand shaking with anger and resolve. This will not be the way my story ends. Because somewhere deep inside him, beneath the humiliation, a fire had begun to burn. The humiliation could have ended quietly. Jonathan could have swallowed it, as he had swallowed so many slights before. He could have gone back to his operating room, buried himself in charts and scalpels, and pretended nothing happened. But this time was different. The next morning, the memory of the guard's smirk and the laughter of his colleagues still burned inside him. He walked into the hospital with his white coat already on, badge visible, but the sting remained. The whispers from the day before lingered in the halls, carried in fragments of conversation he caught as he passed. That's the one security stopped. Doesn't look like much of a doctor, does he? Jonathan could endure many things, long hours, sleepless nights, even the grief of losing patients. But he could not endure the thought of young doctors, nurses, and patients believing that his worth, or the worth of any doctor, could be measured by appearances. So when the hospital scheduled its weekly staff meeting in the main auditorium, Jonathan made a decision. He would speak, not just for himself, but for every unseen, underappreciated doctor who carried the weight of medicine on tired shoulders. The auditorium buzzed with chatter as administrators clicked through PowerPoint slides about budget cuts and efficiency targets. Jonathan sat near the back, his notebook on his lap, his mind steadying like it did before surgery. He could feel the old nerves creeping in. What if they laughed again? What if they dismissed him? But then he remembered his patients. The elderly man who once clasped his hand with gratitude, the little girl who had hugged him after surviving a risky surgery. Their faces steadied him. When the floor opened for comments, Jonathan rose slowly. At first, no one paid attention, but as he walked down the aisle toward the microphone, conversations hushed. Whispers rippled through the room. Some smirked, already anticipating a stumble. Jonathan adjusted the microphone. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm. Yesterday, I was stopped at the entrance of this hospital by security, in front of patients and visitors. I was told I didn't look like a doctor. A few chuckles scattered through the room. Jonathan paused, let the silence grow heavy, then continued. For 15 years, I have walked these halls. I have held the hands of the dying. I have worked shifts so long, I forgot the taste of sleep. I have missed birthdays, holidays, even my own health, for this hospital, for its patients, for this calling. His voice grew steadier, stronger. And yet, in one moment, all of that was erased. Because of how I looked, the room stilled. Jonathan scanned the audience, executives in suits, young residents scrolling on their phones, nurses leaning forward with wide eyes. Doctors don't always look like they do on television. We don't always walk in freshly pressed coats and shining shoes. Sometimes we walk in with stubble on our faces, dark circles under our eyes, our clothes rumpled from sleeping in a chair between surgeries. Sometimes we look human, because we are. A murmur swept the room. Jonathan pressed on. If the measure of a doctor is appearance, then you insult not just me, but every man and woman who sacrifices their lives for this work. You insult the nurse who skips meals to keep a patient alive. You insult the resident who studies until dawn. You insult the surgeon who has the courage to walk into an operating room, knowing failure means death. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward. We are tired. We are flawed. But we are here, and we deserve respect. Not for how we look, but for what we give, for what we risk, for the lives we save when no one else can. A silence deeper than any he had ever heard filled the room. Even the administrators who normally shuffled papers sat frozen. Nurses exchanged glances, some nodding slowly. A young resident lowered his phone, shame flickering across his face. And then, Jonathan noticed her. A young woman near the side of the room, phone raised, recording. Her expression was intense, as though she knew this moment mattered. Jonathan didn't flinch. Let it be recorded. Let the world see. He finished with words he hadn't planned, but felt deeply. One day, I may no longer stand in this hospital. But remember this, the dignity of a doctor does not come from a badge or a coat. It comes from the countless hours, the sacrifices unseen, the lives held in trembling hands. That is what makes us who we are, and no guard, no smirk, no laughter will take that away. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was thick, electric, and then, from the back of the room, a nurse stood and began to clap. Slowly, others followed, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the room thundered with applause. Jonathan stepped back from the microphone, his chest rising and falling, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with release. He had said what needed to be said. He did not yet know that the video recorded that day would spread far beyond the walls of the hospital. He did not yet know that millions of strangers would see his face, hear his voice, and feel his conviction. All he knew, as he walked back to his seat, was that the humiliation had been answered. Not with anger, not with silence, but with truth. Jonathan didn't think much of the speech once it was over. He sat down, heart still pounding, while the auditorium buzzed with uneasy energy. Some clapped out of respect, others avoided his gaze. But the words had been spoken, and that was enough for him. He had defended not just himself, but every doctor who had ever been overlooked. What he didn't know was that the young woman in the corner had uploaded the video within hours. The caption was simple: Doctor silences entire hospital with powerful truth. The shaky footage showed Jonathan gripping the podium, his voice raw with emotion, the stunned faces in the audience, the eruption of applause. By the next morning, the video had thousands of views. By lunchtime, it had millions. Across the country, people watched in silence as Jonathan declared, "Doctors don't always look like they do on television. Sometimes we look human, because we are." They replayed the moment when his voice cracked with passion, when the audience fell quiet, when his words cut deeper than statistics ever could. Teachers shared it, writing, "This is exactly how we feel too. Overworked, undervalued, human." Nurses reposted it. Finally, someone said what we've been screaming for years. Patients left comments. "This man operated on people like me. He deserves more than respect. He deserves honor." On Twitter, hashtags surged. Respect doctors. Jonathan Miller Maddies. We're human. News outlets picked it up. First, local stations ran short segments. Hospital staff moved to silence by surgeons' words. Then, national networks aired the clip during prime time. Morning show hosts replayed the speech, their voices tinged with awe. "This wasn't a politician," one anchor said. "This was a man who had just come off a 36-hour shift, speaking the truth every healthcare worker feels. Talk shows debated it. Columnists wrote about it. Editorials titled, "The Doctor Who Spoke for All of Us," appeared in major papers. Jonathan, meanwhile, was oblivious. He returned to his routine, performing surgeries, checking charts, scribbling notes in his worn notebook. He noticed colleagues eyeing him differently, some with newfound respect, others with resentment, but he didn't yet understand why. It wasn't until his phone buzzed endlessly with messages from old friends, former patients, even strangers, that he realized something had shifted. "Have you seen this?" one text read, with a link to YouTube. Jonathan clicked. There he was, frozen on the screen, standing at the podium, his face etched with fatigue and fire. He watched the video in stunned silence, hearing his own voice echo back at him. When the clip ended, he scrolled through the comments, thousands upon thousands of them. This man should be running hospitals, not begging to get past security. Every word is true. I cried watching this. I don't even know him, but I trust him with my life. Jonathan set the phone down, his hands trembling. For years he had spoken only in operating rooms and quiet hallways, his voice heard by few. Now it was being heard by millions. Requests poured in. Journalists wanted interviews. Podcasts invited him to speak. Advocacy groups asked him to join panels. His inbox overflowed with letters from fellow doctors thanking him for giving their struggles a voice. One email from a young resident in Chicago read, "I was ready to quit. Your words reminded me why I started. Thank you." Jonathan was overwhelmed. He had never sought fame. His life had been about scalpel and sutures, not cameras and microphones. Yet something told him this moment wasn't about him alone. The video had tapped into something larger. The collective exhaustion of an entire profession. The longing for respect across countless industries where sacrifice went unseen. The hospital administration could no longer ignore it. What had begun as an embarrassing incident was now a public relations storm. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, asking staff about the doctor who spoke truth. Patients came in hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Even lawmakers began referencing the video, using it to highlight systemic flaws in healthcare. Jonathan received a call from the hospital board. Their voices were unusually polite, almost deferential. "Dr. Miller," the chairwoman said, "we'd like to formally recognize your contributions. Perhaps you'd consider joining our leadership committee." Jonathan listened, part of him incredulous. A week ago, he had been treated like an intruder at the door. Now, the same people were inviting him to sit at their table. He agreed cautiously, not out of hunger for power, but because he sensed an opportunity. If his voice could carry this far, perhaps it could carry change. Meanwhile, the video showed no signs of slowing. Within weeks, it surpassed 50 million views. It was shown in medical schools as inspiration. High school teachers played it for their students, saying, "This is what courage looks like." And yet, amid all the noise, Jonathan stayed grounded. Each morning, he still tied his shoes, put on his white coat, and returned to the operating room. His patients still needed him. His work had not changed, only the world's awareness of it. But late at night, when the hospital quieted and he sat alone in his apartment, Jonathan allowed himself to wonder, could this moment be more than a viral spark? Could it ignite something lasting? Something that might reshape not only his life, but the very system he had given everything to? He didn't know the answer yet, but he knew one thing. The humiliation that had once silenced him had now been transformed into a voice that could no longer be ignored. And beyond the hospital walls, powerful eyes were watching. The world that once looked past Jonathan Miller suddenly couldn't look away. His video wasn't just viral, it had become a rallying cry. For weeks, television anchors replayed his words, each time with new commentary. Radio hosts quoted him during morning commutes. Editorial cartoons depicted him standing in a white coat, towering over hospital administrators, holding calculators and spreadsheets. But what moved Jonathan most were the letters. They came by the hundreds, arriving in thick stacks at the hospital and through his personal email. Some were typed and polished, others handwritten in shaky script. One was from a retired nurse in Arizona. "I gave 30 years of my life to nursing. Your words made me cry. Finally, someone spoke for us." Another was from a high school student. "I want to be a doctor one day. People say it's too hard, but your speech made me believe it's worth it." A mother wrote, "You saved my son years ago in surgery. Watching you speak reminded me why I trusted you with his life." Jonathan read each letter slowly, sometimes with tears blurring the ink. These voices, these stories, reminded him that he was not alone. His humiliation had become a bridge, connecting him to thousands who had walked similar paths. News crews soon arrived at the hospital. They camped outside, hoping to catch him between surgeries. At first, Jonathan avoided them, slipping through side doors. He wasn't comfortable with cameras, but eventually he agreed to a single interview. The reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, asked softly, "Dr. Miller, why did you decide to speak up that day?" Jonathan thought for a long moment. Then he answered, "Because I realized silence was hurting more than speaking ever could. Every day, doctors and nurses give everything they have. And every day, they're treated as if they're replaceable. I wanted to remind people that behind every white coat is a human being. Tired, flawed, but committed." The interview aired that evening. By the next morning, Jonathan's face was on front pages across the country. The headline read, "The Doctor Who Spoke for the Silent." Recognition followed quickly. He was invited to medical conferences, not as an attendee, but as a keynote speaker. Universities asked him to address their graduating classes. Even political leaders quoted his speech in debates about healthcare reform. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere shifted. The same colleagues who had smirked at him now approached with respect. Some apologized quietly in hallways. Others, too proud to admit their change of heart, simply treated him with a new deference. The security guard who had once blocked his way avoided his eyes whenever they crossed paths. Patients, too, looked at him differently. They asked for him by name, comforted by the idea that their doctor wasn't just skilled, but also courageous enough to defend dignity in a world that often stripped it away. One afternoon, Jonathan walked into the waiting room and was startled to see a group of patients holding handmade signs. "Thank you, Dr. Miller." They clapped as he entered, their gratitude raw and unfiltered. Jonathan stood frozen, his throat tight. He had saved lives before, but this was the first time he truly felt seen. Still, he remained humble. He wore the same worn shoes, carried the same scuffed bag, scribbled in the same notebook. When asked about the fame, he shrugged. "I'm still just a doctor. My patients don't need a celebrity. They need care." But privately, he began to sense something stirring. Recognition wasn't just about applause or headlines. It was about responsibility. People were listening now. People who could change things. And that meant his words carried a new weight. The hospital board, sensing both opportunity and pressure, invited him to sit on advisory panels. At first, Jonathan hesitated. He was a surgeon, not a politician. But when he sat at those tables and looked at charts of budget cuts and staffing shortages, he realized he could bring the stories that numbers ignored. During one meeting, an executive said coldly, "We need to trim costs in emergency care." Jonathan laid down a photo of a child he had saved in the ER. "This boy would be dead if those cuts existed last year. Tell me, what's the cost of his life?" The room fell silent. Jonathan wasn't just recognized now, he was respected. And yet, he remained cautious. Recognition could be fleeting. Today's hero could be tomorrow's forgotten man. But deep down, he sensed that something permanent had shifted, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. For years, Jonathan had been content to serve quietly, to bear the struggles in silence. Now he understood that his voice was part of his service. Healing didn't end in the operating room. It extended to halls of power, to the public, to every place where decisions shaped lives. Recognition was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Because whispers were already spreading through the city, through the state, through the nation. Whispers that the man who had once been stopped at the door might soon hold the keys to the hospital itself. The boardroom of St. Matthew's Hospital was a place Jonathan Miller had entered only a handful of times in his career. It was far removed from the frantic pace of the ER and the sterile calm of the operating room. Here, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old money. Oil portraits of past directors hung along the panelled walls, their stern gazes watching over the long mahogany table. Jonathan sat at one end of that table now, his white coat draped over his chair, his hands folded over his notebook. Across from him sat the board members, men and women in tailored suits, some with cautious smiles, others with the guarded expressions of people calculating risk. The chairwoman, a silver-haired woman with a measured voice, began. "Dr. Miller, thank you for joining us. As you know, the attention your speech has drawn has been significant." Jonathan inclined his head. "I didn't intend to draw attention. I only meant to speak the truth." A murmur of acknowledgement passed around the table. One man adjusted his tie and said, "Be that as it may, the hospital's name is now tied to yours. For better or worse, you are a public figure." Jonathan waited, saying nothing. Years in surgery had taught him patience. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The chairwoman continued, "The board has been discussing ways to navigate this moment. We believe you could play a vital role, not only as a surgeon, but as a part of our leadership. Your voice carries weight with the public. It could carry weight here as well." Jonathan's brows furrowed. "Leadership? You mean advisory committees, policy discussions?" Another board member leaned forward. "More than that. We want you to join our executive team. To help shape the direction of this hospital, Jonathan's instinct was to refuse. He had never sought politics. His place was with patients, not with spreadsheets. But before he could answer, the chairwoman raised a hand. "Dr. Miller, let me be candid. Public trust in hospitals is fragile. Costs rise, staff morale falls, patients feel lost in the system. And yet, your speech reminded people what medicine is supposed to be. That's powerful. That's exactly what this institution needs." Jonathan looked down at his hands. They were calloused, nicked from years of work. Hands that had sutured arteries, steadied scalpels, carried lives. Could those same hands steer a hospital? He thought of his patients, of the overcrowded wards, the nurses stretched too thin, the young residents burning out before their time. He thought of the security guard's smirk, the administrator's cold efficiency, the endless battles between care and cost. Maybe sitting at this table wasn't abandoning his calling. Maybe it was expanding it. "I'm no businessman," Jonathan said finally. "I'm a doctor. My decisions come from lives, not ledgers." The chairwoman smiled faintly. "That's exactly why we need you." For weeks after, Jonathan balanced two worlds. By day, he still performed surgeries, walking the halls in scrubs. By night, he attended board meetings, poring over financial reports, staffing plans, community outreach programs. He felt like a stranger in both places, too blunt for the executives, too bureaucratic for the doctors. But he pressed on. He began speaking not only in meetings, but in public forums, addressing parents, patients, and staff. Each time, his words carried the same raw honesty as his original speech. "A hospital is not a business," he said at one town hall. "It is a promise. A promise that when you walk through these doors, you will be seen, cared for, respected. That is the standard we must meet, not profit margins." The applause was thunderous. The video clips spread again, momentum built. Jonathan's presence reassured the public, inspired the staff, and pressured the board to listen. Slowly, policies began to shift. More funding was directed to emergency care. Nursing staff received long overdue support. Even the cafeteria improved because Jonathan insisted that those who saved lives deserved more than cold sandwiches. But the real turning point came months later. The hospital's longtime director, a man more comfortable with investors than patients, announced his retirement. Whispers filled the halls. Who would take his place? The usual names floated: seasoned administrators, polished executives. But again and again, one name rose above the rest: Dr. Jonathan Miller. At first, Jonathan dismissed it. He was a surgeon, not an administrator. But then the board approached him directly. The chairwoman looked him in the eye and said, "Dr. Miller, we would like to formally offer you the position of hospital director." The room spun. Jonathan heard the words but struggled to believe them. Him, the man once stopped at the hospital door, treated like a stranger in the very place he had given his life to, now being asked to lead it. "I don't know if I'm the right man for this," he admitted. The chairwoman's reply was gentle but firm. "You are. Because you remember what this hospital is for. Because you will never forget that behind every number is a life. That is the leadership we need." Jonathan sat in silence, the weight of the offer pressing down. He thought of his parents, who had sacrificed so much to put him through school. He thought of the countless nights alone in the hospital, the humiliations, the struggles. He thought of the patients who had entrusted him with their lives. Finally, he whispered, "If I do this, it will not be for prestige. It will be for them, for the patients, for the staff, for every person who walks through these doors." The chairwoman nodded. "That's all we ask." And so, the man who had once been blocked at the hospital entrance was now being handed the keys to it. The brass plaque outside the office read, "Director, Dr. Jonathan Miller." For many, it was just a title. For Jonathan, it was surreal. Every morning he paused outside the heavy oak door, remembering the day he had been stopped by security at the very same entrance. Now, he walked through these halls not as a suspect, but as their leader. But Jonathan refused to let the title change him. He still arrived early, his shoes scuffed, his white coat often draped over his suit jacket. He greeted the janitors by name, thanked the cafeteria workers for their meals, and stopped in the halls to check on nurses. For him, leadership was not about sitting in a polished chair. It was about walking alongside those who carried the hospital on their backs. His first weeks as director were a whirlwind. The hospital was struggling with debt, low morale, and a reputation scarred by bureaucracy. Executives urged him to focus on numbers, to assure investors, to polish the image. Jonathan listened, then shook his head. "A hospital is not a company," he said firmly during his first leadership meeting. "It is a sanctuary. If we put patients second to profits, we have already failed." The board shifted uncomfortably, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He began making changes immediately. He toured every department, not with a clipboard, but with a notebook filled with questions. "What do you need?" he asked nurses in the ICU. "What's broken?" he asked custodians. "What would make your job better?" he asked residents. And he listened, not as a politician gathering sound bites, but as a doctor gathering diagnoses. He discovered broken equipment left unfixed for months, schedules that burned out staff, supply closets empty when they should have been stocked. Each problem went into his notebook. Each problem became a priority. He fought for better staffing ratios, ensuring nurses weren't stretched beyond reason. He pushed to repair leaking ceilings and outdated machines. He restructured budgets so that patient care came before executive perks. When told there wasn't enough money, he cut unnecessary luxuries in administration, expensive retreats, catered meetings, office renovations, and redirected the funds to buy new monitors for the NICU. Word spread quickly. This was a director who cared. Staff who had once dragged themselves through shifts began to feel pride again. Patients noticed the difference too. The atmosphere of the hospital began to change. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive, hopeful. Jonathan also created open forums every month. Anyone, nurses, interns, janitors, even patients, could stand up and speak. At the first meeting, people were hesitant. But Jonathan stood at the front, listening intently, jotting notes in his worn notebook. "Your voice matters here," he told them. "This hospital is ours. Not just mine, not just the board's, but all of ours." By the third month, the auditorium was packed. His reforms drew national attention. News outlets that had once covered his viral speech now reported on his leadership. From scalpel to steering wheel, one headline read. Another called him the People's Director. But Jonathan never let the praise distract him. He knew leadership meant hard choices too. There were long nights reviewing budgets, tense confrontations with board members resistant to change, and the constant weight of responsibility. Mistakes would land on his shoulders, successes often unnoticed. And yet, he embraced it, because leadership, he realized, was not about wielding power. It was about bearing responsibility. It was about carrying the weight so others didn't have to. One of his most symbolic acts was directed at the hospital entrance, the very place he had been humiliated. Jonathan ordered a new plaque installed. "All who heal, all who serve, belong here." Beneath it, he placed a bench and a plaque dedicated to doctors, nurses, and staff who had given their lives in service. Every morning, he stopped there for a moment of silence before beginning his day. The security guard who had once blocked him still worked at the hospital. One morning, Jonathan encountered him at the entrance. The man stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. Jonathan simply nodded. "Good morning," he said softly. Then he walked on. There was no need for revenge. His presence was answer enough. For Jonathan, the journey from doctor to leader wasn't about personal victory. It was about proving that hospitals could be more than cold institutions. They could be places of dignity, compassion, and respect for patients and staff alike. And as he stood in his office late one evening, lights of the city twinkling outside, Jonathan opened his notebook and wrote a new sentence beneath the one he had written months ago after his humiliation. "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The morning light spilled across the glass doors of St. Matthew's Hospital, just as it had on the day Jonathan Miller was stopped and humiliated. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no suspicion, no smirks, no whispers. Instead, the lobby buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread quickly. The new director was arriving for his first official address to the staff. Nurses whispered to each other in the hallways. Patients sat up in waiting room chairs, curious to glimpse the man whose speech had once shaken the world outside. Even the janitors paused in their sweeping, leaning on mops with quiet smiles. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doors opened and Jonathan walked in. He wore a simple navy suit, his white coat draped neatly over his arm, and carried the same worn leather bag he had owned for years. His shoes were still scuffed, his face still marked by the lines of long nights and countless hours. But he walked with the steady confidence of a man who finally belonged. The moment he stepped inside, the entire lobby fell silent. Then, one by one, people began to rise. First the nurses, then the residents, then the doctors, administrators, and even patients. The security guards at the entrance, once so quick to block his way, now stood at attention, their eyes lowered in respect. And then the applause began. It started softly, like a ripple on water, then grew louder, swelling until it filled every corner of the hospital. The sound echoed against the marble walls, thunderous and unrelenting. Nurses clapped with tears in their eyes. Doctors applauded with pride. Patients joined in, some raising their hands in gratitude. Jonathan paused, overcome. The last time he had stood in this very spot, he had been treated as an outsider. Now he was welcomed as their leader. The contrast was almost too much to bear. He took a deep breath, then raised his hand gently, signaling for quiet. The applause slowed, then faded into an expectant hush. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice calm but strong. "Months ago, I was stopped at these very doors. I was told I didn't look like I belonged here, that I wasn't who I said I was. That moment was humiliating. But in truth, it wasn't just about me. It was about what too many of us feel every day, that our sacrifices go unseen, our humanity unrecognized. He let the silence linger, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. But today, as I stand before you, I am reminded of something greater. This hospital is not defined by titles or uniforms. It is defined by the people inside it, by the nurses who carry this place on their backs, by the residents who work until dawn, by the janitors who keep these halls clean, by the doctors who give everything they have, even when no one is watching. The audience listened, rapt. Jonathan's words carried not from a podium, but from the heart. "This hospital is ours," he continued. "It belongs to everyone who steps inside, not just to administrators, not just to leaders, but to every soul who comes seeking healing. And as long as I am director, I promise you this: dignity will not be optional here. Respect will not be conditional. Every person, staff, patient, visitor, will be seen and valued." The applause rose again, louder than before, breaking the silence with thunderous force. Some shouted his name, others wept openly. The sound reverberated like a chorus of redemption, a celebration not just of one man's journey, but of a culture shifting before their eyes. Jonathan stood still, humbled, letting the applause wash over him. He wasn't basking in glory, he was bearing witness to change. This was bigger than him. It was about the countless others who had felt invisible, and the promise that they never would again. As he turned toward the main staircase, Jonathan's eyes briefly met those of the guard who had once stopped him. The man looked down, ashamed, but Jonathan simply nodded. There was no need for anger. The moment itself was enough. He ascended the stairs slowly, the applause still roaring behind him, and at the top he turned once more to face the crowd. The image was unforgettable. The man once dismissed as a fraud, now standing tall as the director of the very hospital that had doubted him. For a moment, Jonathan remembered the words he had written in his notebook the night of his humiliation. "This will not be the way my story ends." And now, with hundreds rising to honor him, he whispered to himself, "This is how it begins."